I know this thing is on, and I know that you can hear me. Nursing and healthcare needs advocates and activism. So what are you waiting for? Let's do the damn thing. If you've heard the phrase nurse to patient ratio saves people's lives, you've probably heard it from this one guest that's coming on the show today. We are facing a crisis in healthcare, hallway medicine, crippling burnout, staff leaving still in droves. There still isn't a very clear solution. However, there are experts that have been doing this work for years that have shown time and time again that advocacy through collective action can actually make change. Leading the charge here to fix that is Michael Hurley, the president of the Ontario Council of Hospital Unions. Michael's here to discuss the realities of the unfunded hospitals, the deliberate political choices that are driving privatization, and his union strategy to win mandatory staffing levels. This is more than a conversation about labor. It is about using our collective power to demand change and to see quality public services. Michael Hurley sits at the intersection of healthcare, labor, and political action. He's the current president of the Ontario Council of Hospital Unions, representing nearly 50,000 workers on the front lines in our hospitals. For years, he's been one of the most vocal and persistent advocates fighting against chronic underfunding and privatization of our public healthcare system. Today, we are talking to Michael about the urgent campaign for mandated nurse to patient ratios, the crisis related to nursing retention, and why it truly takes working people to use their voice to challenge the status quo and to make change. Welcome, Michael Hurley, to the show. Thank you so much for coming to the Gritty Nurse podcast, Michael. One of the things that I usually like to start my episodes off with is really just a little bit of background information. And I know you well because I've been following you as long as I've been on Twitter, but just so maybe our other listeners can get to know you a little bit better. So if you don't mind, Michael, could you give us a little bit of background about who you are, what led you into advocacy, and how you became a union leader?
I work at what was a chronic care hospital as I was hired as an orderly. The conditions there were, pretty Victorian. They treated the staff as servants, and there was a fair bit of racism and, of course, sexism, particularly manifested in terms of rates of pay. I, for example, was hired as an orderly, and I earned $1 an hour more than RNAs did, even though I had no formal training and they had been to school for 6 months. I just give you that as an example.
Wild.
You didn't have to be too smart to figure it out. So yeah, I mean, I got involved. We had an illegal strike, and subsequently I was elected to a position of leadership for a union in the hospital sector, and I spend a fair bit of my time, advocating around questions of access, capacity, etc. Yeah.
Yeah. You've been doing this for a long time, 1977 and onwards.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, a long time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think one of the things that people might not understand is the whole idea behind illegal striking, right? I think that's probably one of the most poignant conversations that we're having today. We're seeing it. One of the largest strikes in the US is actually occurring. I think they were on a 5-day strike. I think they're still striking today, but it's just something that I think it's almost like a bad word here, and it really shouldn't be because
Yes.
that's really how we force change. And I love how the nurses out there and the various other unions describe the reason why they're striking is really to improve patient satisfaction, to improve patient safety. And I think people don't understand sometimes when they see workers out on the front lines and on the pickets, they don't understand that fundamentally we know what's happening behind closed doors, and if we don't come out here to not just bargain but to fight for more, that we're going to continue to see that deterioration of our healthcare systems. And I know you've been working towards that for quite some time. Could you tell us a little bit more about the hospital strike in 1981? You mentioned that it was illegal. Could you just share a little bit more with our listeners?
Well, it was 10 days long. It was over the subject of concessions that were being asked around sick leave formally, although Dr. Jerry White from Western University wrote a book about the strike, and he thought that the strike was actually about workload and speed up and a predominantly female workforce just having reached the end of its limits. I would say in reflection, like I'm very proud of that, of all of the heroism that individuals showed and collectively that strike had a pretty traditional orientation in that it meant to shut down production, But in the context of a hospital, of course, production involves human beings. And as I've gotten older, I'm much more attracted to the model of the British nurses, for example, recently, where they did strike, but they reassured the public that cancer care, emergency services, clinics, surgeries would still be operating. The strike is really a political strike. It's in some senses nominal, but it's not meant to hurt the population who already have, they're suffering individually. It's meant to advance a political agenda. And I thought they did that really brilliantly.
Yeah, I do remember hearing about when that occurred, and I think that I think there's got to be different ways that we can kind of go about explaining and letting the public know why we're doing these things, right? And I think there is that huge disconnect between why there might be a strike action versus why there might not be, or why there might be other forms of actions that are used. And I think it's important that we kind of delineate the two. I know that one of the things is nurses in Ontario and particularly in other provinces cannot actually strike. There is, within our union bodies, there is a no strike, no lockout clause. So we won't see those same things where, for example, we saw nurses that were locked out of the hospital recently in the US who were there to attend patient care, but they're actually locked outside. And they're just like, well, how does this help support, patient care and patient flow? And again, just talking about the fact that this is just like another crippling part to the public system is when we see that creep of privatization coming in, where we see, there are nurses that are readily available to work, but we hire agencies or staffing agencies
Yes.
to kind of fill those roles. And then we're using public dollars to pay for private profits, which is a whole other huge part of the conversation. But kind of on the topic of, nurses and striking, because I know that, so what does CUPE cover? It covers quite a number of different workers, right?
Our largest occupational group are registered practical nurses in the hospitals, but there's also personal support workers or healthcare aides or porters or tradespeople, clerical staff, food service, laundry, cleaning, a range of support functions generally. Yeah.
That I'm glad that you gave that overview, but just kind of bringing it back to like nursing. And I think it's important that people do know that all of those groups are there. Cause I could tell you when I was working in the hospital as an educator, I remember when we were looking at workflow tasks, and all of a sudden my director was just like, oh, we need to like have cleaning staff and these different people, being a part of this workflow. And I was like, this doesn't really seem like cleaning staff. This seems more like nursing or whatever the case may be. And their union, so CUPE, came in and was like, nope, this is not. And I was just kind of like, I know that our organizations know, and they just try to continue to, like, it's like a scope creep, right? So it's just like they
Yes.
try to continue to put little bits into other people's roles to just kind of see how far they can maximize and push it. And I'm so glad that, that union QB came out, was just like, oh, hell no, these cleaners and aides, this is not specific to their role. This is actually nursing specific. And I was like, good, I'm
Yes.
glad that they got pushed back. But
Yes.
one of the things that you have been working on, and what kind of caught my attention, is that there was a new academic study that was commissioned by CUPE and was released, I believe, like around August 2025, which discussed staffing ratios. And it's this huge conversation. I remember, one of the things that the chief nursing officer of Canada did, she did some work around how do we retain nurses? How do we keep nurses at the bedside? And one of the things that came out of that was talking about staffing ratios. I keep hearing this. So we've seen various different models, like in California, I think BC has started, but for whatever reason, there's not a lot of mobilization or energy from, the other forces that may be, to say, okay, this is something that is needed. So would you mind telling us a little bit about that report? Let's start there.
I mean, we've done a lot of work with researchers from the University of Windsor around healthcare worker morale, nurse morale, and around the issue of violence, and around the experience of the healthcare workforce during COVID. And, the interviews with nurses in particular, and the polling that we've done, shows that many of the nurses we represent are exhausted, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally and morally, working in a system where they try their hardest to keep patient care at a high quality, and ultimately have to accept that it's not possible given the numbers of nurses that are disposed to care for patients. And, you know, the fact that in other jurisdictions, Australia is a great example, as you know, where they introduced these ratios and attracted back, in their case, they're smaller than we are in the state where this was done, but 7,500 nurses who returned to practice in hospitals because they now felt, as a result of ratios, that they could actually perform the kind of nursing that would really help patients and that they could
Right.
feel good about. And I think you see those same improvements in mortality rates for patients, in patient care outcomes, in nurse satisfaction, family satisfaction, in all the studies that have been done. And we have this, as you mentioned, now in British Columbia. It's fairly new there, but they are doing a baseline study there, something that we need to do here in Ontario. They did bargain this in Nova Scotia. So this is an idea which is really gaining momentum.
Right.
And it's probably the most significant patient advocacy piece we've ever dealt with. It's probably the most significant occupational health and safety issue for nurses that we've ever dealt with. So it's a very exciting concept.
Yeah, in most recent news, I've seen that the Ontario Hospital Association has pretty much said no, and they've cited their reasons for saying no, which I had read, and I thought that they weren't very adequate reasons for saying no. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, the Ontario Hospital Association, is deeply committed to their management rights, and having to accept standards for care that they have to meet is not something they have any interest in, nor have they been willing to, like, do a pilot project with us just to experiment, do a university study with us, even set up a committee or have a meeting of all of the unions and employers to talk about whether this idea might have merit. Can you imagine? Like, this is being tested in other jurisdictions. It's got all this evidence that it's having this beneficial impact on patients and on nurses, and the employers say they're not interested. But to some
Wild.
extent, they're also shilling for the provincial government, which then would know that they would have to come up with additional nurses, right?
Right.
We'd have to put some real energy into recruiting and hiring and retaining nurses, which we're actually not doing. And so, I mean, I think this is the conflict, between the status quo, which says, well, we're okay with grinding these nurses down, and with the fact that probably thousands of people die because of the inferior care that we're providing. There's no there's no evidence of that, really. So, it's no biggie. I mean, that's really what we're dealing with, right? And I think this whole debate really forces this to the forefront.
Yeah, it's very frustrating, right? When these organizations won't even come to meet. I think that the fundamental aspect is, if we're saying that we're using evidence-based practices or evidence-based models to make care more efficient, to make it care more safe, how are we not even sitting at the table or meeting with organizations who are very close to this? So like nurses are close to this, CUPE,
Right.
other organizations that are
Right.
doing the work. How can a huge organization like that just say, okay, no, we're just not going to? It's more than frustrating. It's insane, actually. And I think this is where I would ask you, so like, what can we do? What can everyday people do, knowing that they're not willing to even have the conversation? Because I think that's obviously the starting point. They know that the evidence is there, because I've seen it too, and it's been replicated in various other places like you mentioned. So what is it that we can do as, citizens, as nurses, as, patient advocates, to put some more pressure on these organizations to do something?
Well, I think you're doing something important. I mean, your podcast is really very influential. But I think people, pressure on individual community hospitals, pressure on the CEOs. So why won't you sit down? Why won't your hospital association do a pilot study of this somewhere, and of the member of provincial parliament? All of the Conservatives voted against. We now have a bill it's been reintroduced for the second time, which would enshrine nurse patient ratios. The NDP has promoted it, supported by the Liberals and the Greens. All the Conservatives voted against it last time. For anyone with a Conservative MPP, the question is, I think, what the heck? And for the Liberals and the Greens and the NDP, are you committed to this? Like, if you form
Mm.
government, are you committed to this? I think that would be, those would be things that we could be doing, as individuals.
Yeah, I think again, it's sometimes really frustrating when you like even have a conversation with a nurse to be like, "Do you know who your MPP is? Do you know who your MP is?" And they're like, "No," and it's like, "Well, you should.
Right.
Like, you
Right.
absolutely should." I think one of the things that I used to do, and I probably will still do it. We used to do these like kind of phone call attacks as well as just like inundating our MPs, whether it's their emails, just to be like, here is a
Yes.
pressing concern. And I think that again, continue to have these conversations and let people know like what's fundamentally happening, and using various different forms, whether it's social media, to kind of say, hey, we've called you out, and now it's the ball is in your court, you need to act.
Yes.
Are those important strategies? Now I'm going to continue to push because it just makes no sense. Like, and
Yes.
I have something. We'll talk about it after the episode that we could do together. But again, we just need to. I think informing people about what's happening is also important, and then also letting them know it's like your care is being compromised. It's currently being compromised because
Yes.
here are the reasons why we can't get to the task that we need to do, and just letting people know that there are other ways to do things. Right. I think one of the things that were kind of like the death of nursing and various different other professions is like, oh, this is the way that we've always done things. Well, clearly it's not working. So we have to do something radically different. You mentioned about privatization, and just recently
Yes.
I have seen it's so like I see these things come across my desk and I get furious. And I know that I know I got to redirect my anger, but I think one of the things is there is chronic underfunding within the public health care system. And you mentioned about private agencies. Over $9 billion has been spent in the last 10 years in relation to staffing agencies. What are your thoughts on how we can change that? One of the things I think is just like, why don't hospitals actually hire full time nurses? But what are
Right.
your thoughts?
Well, the extent of the use of private agencies, staffing agencies, which the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives exposed in their report in May, which provoked a fury from the Premier's office and from the Ontario Hospital Association again, was really instructive. We have noticed subsequently, because there have been some legal challenges to the use of agencies for nursing, that many of the big hospitals have really stopped to a large extent using agencies. But this is still a real phenomenon, particularly in northern and rural communities where ER shutdowns, like as we speak, St. Joseph's Island, the hospital there in Thessalon, and St. Mary's and others, right, are suffering from recurrent ER closures as a result of nursing and physician shortages. And, what you see from this government is this lethargy around the issue of nurse recruitment. Like, for example, the police, like, you want to be a police cadet? Well, we'll pay you to go to college, right? We will pay you not just your tuition, you will be on a salary to go to college. But you want to be a nurse? No, no, you're on your own. We might give you $5,000 for you. Like, what is with that? And
I
I'm
know
not saying we shouldn't pay
what's with
people to
that.
go to police college. I think it's a great idea to pay people to go to school for occupations where we have shortages. But again, we've got this glaring, and it seems a gender thing, and it also is a sort of a pretty loud underlining of the fact that they really aren't committed to recruiting and hiring properly to offset the need for these private staffing agencies, which,
Right.
as you know, are often headed up, by people who have, ties to the current government, right? Unfortunately.
Absolutely. And we know that, folks like Mike Harris, he owns probably one of the biggest ones. And we've seen what has happened under his regime in relation to healthcare. And let's be real here. Here's my like little gritty hat coming on. Look at how police unions, particularly in Ontario, when the election time was coming around, look at how their tweets were. Clearly, they had an agenda. And again, I would say policing is actually very small in number in relation to nursing. But we know if they mobilize their numbers, they can probably sit down and say, hey, if you don't do this for us, we won't vote for you. Nursing has like we should be political, and maybe that's a part of our political strategy to be like, you know what, if you guys don't do this, we will take our 180 plus nursing workforce here and we just won't vote. in that way. Because again, if policing was able to do it and they're getting all these various different concessions, why can't nurses do it? It's just a question.
Absolutely. And what you see with police and with fire is a very successful promotion of their occupations, wrapping courage and heroism and bravery and risk and protection and love of the public and everything around them, and creating some sort of like almost idolatry around all of that, right? And you only see a glimpse of that around nursing coming out of the pandemic, when there was an appreciation. And what I noticed among the people that we represent coming out of the pandemic was they understood the value that people were putting on the work they were doing. Maybe for the first time, they had a sense of that same adulation or admiration, that police and fire feel on a regular basis. And it really, really empowered people. I mean, we are like the healthcare workforce, 500,000 people in Ontario. We're talking about the hospitals, but as you know, like everyone who works in home care is ruthlessly exploited, and the conditions
Yes.
there for the people who are being provided care for are abysmal. And retirement homes and long-term care. Like if we could mobilize this workforce to advocate for itself and for the people we look after, we would be a force for good in this province.
I completely agree. I think we could make so much change if we could actually get like our crap together and be like, all right, this is our strategy. I don't think people would truly understand the power that healthcare workers would have if we're just like, you know what? This is how we're going to vote. We just won't vote for this government.
Yes.
That would literally shift the entire political party. Like it
Yes.
would be insane what we'd be able to do. Again, we're working on it, right, Michael?
Yes. Yes. We're working on it.
And I think you mentioned violence too. So again, just kind of juxtaposing how police and firefighter are treated. So they're under presumptive care models. So for example, if there is violence on the job, they get better protections and support for mental health. And even in relation to funding, so bill 124 capped us at 1% wage. I know there are still nurses that are like, hey, where's our back pay? Nursing asking for funding increases seemed like this negative thing where police were getting 12 plus percent, and firefighters. And again, it just begs the question as to like, what else do we need to do to, it's not even just to prove our worth, but to actually show that we do deserve these changes. And violence is a big conversation. I had done a podcast earlier in the year talking about assault, and particularly of a nurse who worked by herself in a psychiatric unit, acute care, and then ended up later. And again, I'm not linking the two, but again, we know correlation doesn't equal causation. After her assault in February, she died by suicide in April. It's very concerning to me that as nurses, we are seen as these individuals that can go on the job and that harm is like a part of the job. Because I know if I worked at a grocery store and someone jumped across the table and punched me in the face, that I would charge them with assault. What do we need to be telling healthcare workers and other organizations like unions surrounding this language? Because I'll be honest, I don't feel like it's strong enough. I don't feel like our organizations are saying, okay, at the end of the day, if you are assaulted, it's assault.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, an amendment to the Canadian Criminal Code died as a result of the federal election. It would have made assault against a healthcare worker on the job a more serious offense for the purposes of sentencing, which exists for transit workers. And it exists for police, right?
Right? This
I
is
mean,
insane.
the stories I could tell you about, a nurse is sexually assaulted in a small hospital. It's part of a group of hospitals. We ask for the patient to be moved. They won't do it. We ask for security guards to be hired. They won't do it. Same patient tries to assault another patient, right? Like, nurses who are threatened at work, then followed home. They go to the police. The police don't really take it seriously. Like it's the whole system conspires really to say it's part of your job. We did a poll, like 30% of our frontline or nursing workforce had been sexually assaulted during their career. Like, come on,
That's crazy.
you know? And like in any one year, 60% are physically assaulted. And then there's the racial attacks. And, like this is a toxic work environment, right? And you don't get any energy from the employer in dealing with it. Even some places won't even put up violence will not be tolerated posters or zero tolerance, or let alone accept
But
the
that should be like the
integration
bare
of that
minimum almost.
philosophy, right? Like,
Yeah.
can you believe this stuff? Like, it's, yeah, yeah, no, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean the bare minimum should be violence isn't tolerated, and I tell my nurse colleagues that because I get them in my DMs. I get people messaging me on LinkedIn. I get people messaging me on Twitter or Instagram, and they're telling me they're like, "What do I say? What do I do?" And I'm like, "Well, at the end of the day, you are a citizen. Like you are a human being." Because I think the title is also a part of it, and I'll ask you a little bit about the call coming from inside of the house in terms of some of these issues. But again, at the end of the day, we still have the same human rights as anybody else here
Yes.
in Ontario, in Canada. So I'm like, it really shouldn't be up to your manager or your director or even your union to decide whether you should press charges or not. At the end of the day, from the legal counseling I've had, they're just like, the courts will decide the mental
Yes.
capacity of that individual. You have every right to charge them with assault. And I
Yes.
don't understand why that language isn't used within our circles. So what do you think, Michael? Is a little bit of the call coming from inside the house in terms of why nurses aren't coming forward and other healthcare professionals aren't coming forward and pressing charges?
Well, I think, from the moment this happens, they are discouraged usually, every step of the way. And that discouragement continues to the police, and it continues to the Crown prosecutors, right? And, again, is gender not part of this? We live in a society where the rates of domestic violence, and murder of women in domestic relationships is unacceptable, and these social attitudes are carried by people into these workplaces, and people feel that if they don't have appropriate service, or perhaps they are intoxicated. That's often something here. They explode and take their rage out on a worker, and the worker does not receive meaningful support in
Right.
most cases to deal with this. And often, like, I can tell you stories of, on PSW thrown through a wall by somebody who was in the ER on crystal meth, like six people trying to wrestle this person to the ground. And, spine was damaged, cut off WCB six times, lost his house. I just give you this as an example.
Yeah.
The people who are injured through violence are left to cope on their own. They're just thrown in the garbage. I
Yeah,
mean,
that's that's not right. That's not right. And it is so frustrating. And I think that there has to be much more done. And again, I keep saying to, our various different organizations that like it's not enough. We can't I know that just recently there was like a federal, I think it was like a federal nursing unions meeting where all these different leaders come
yes,
to the table and they talk to the various different provincial premiers across the board. And I know that violence was a part of the agenda. And again, I was even hearing just from some of my colleagues that were there that it was just like there didn't seem to be a push or an effort to be like, this is something that we need to tackle. So I will continue to urge my colleagues. I'm like, you know what? If you are feeling unsupported, remember there are rules and regulations way outside of nursing. And I think people forget that. It's just like, okay, you may be dissuaded, but you have the support of, a judicial system that still will actually like look into this. And I think that
yes,
we need stronger language. We need
yes,
managers and directors to be like, this is inappropriate. We need or hospitals to be like,
yes,
violence is not tolerated here. If you think that this is an action that you will, you might actually not be serviced here. Or even if we continue to push for that legislation, I think that's hugely important that we have something that might dissuade people to think twice, right? And you mentioned the fact that the manosphere is a part of that. Like people are being educated at earlier ages in terms of how they treat and talk to women. Like I have teenage boys that are 13, and I am surprised that it's creeping in even as they're 13-year-old boys. So it's just like there's a lot of work we need to do in terms of having these conversations. And I think I would say that it's still a part of healthcare in terms of the work that we need to do to continue to educate people to say that, this type of behavior will not be tolerated and won't be accepted. And we need to continue to push for stronger legislation. And that's why I say, like, we need to vote with our feet.
Yes. Yes.
Before we go, what are some critical issues or issues that are top of mind for you that we might have not discussed that we need to start seeing change in relation to some of the work that you're doing?
Well, I mean, two issues I just mentioned. One is, sort of anticipatory that in the free trade talks that are going to unfold with the United States, that the U.S. is going to be pushing for private access to the Medicare market. And so I think we should anticipate that we have a battle ahead of us on that front.
Yeah, that's really
And
scary.
and the other one is that, the Ford government has told hospitals to plan for a 2% budget increase, and their budget numbers show like a cut of 1,000 hospital beds. So you can imagine that this government, which promised to end hallway medicine, now people will be on stretchers for longer in hallways because there are no beds to admit them to it, you know.
Right.
So battles are going to be underway in communities across Ontario to defend public hospitals and access to these services, and that's kind of top of mind today, in addition to the other issues we talked about.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I saw out of the report, so like hospitals are asking for like over $1 billion in operation funds.
Yes.
And then you mentioned that they're looking at 2% increases, which is like half of what they were
Right.
receiving. And I think people have to understand it's like, okay, your hospital food isn't just going to get worse or your parking fees aren't going to get up. This is going to impact care. And I
Right.
know the article and the government is like, oh yeah, we won't get to the point where it's going to affect clinical services, but like we have, we're smarter than that. We already
Yes.
know that clinical services are affected. The stories that we continue to hear about people waiting in EDs, dying in the emergency
Yes.
department, needlessly related to sepsis and different things. Like, we know that the problems are already here. So how can we not anticipate that there'll be more problems in relation to underfunding the current system? It's insane to me. I was reading what some of the CEOs were saying in relation to the service cuts, and they're like, of course we're going to work a way that we don't have to deal with that, but what's going to happen, it'll be like these smaller emergency departments that are already struggling that we're going to see cuts to. And like you mentioned, the beds, and it's always so funny when people are like, oh yeah, we opened up new beds. It's like there's some of these beds are actually like existing beds, so they haven't really actually done anything and mobilized any type of change. But yeah, I'm very concerned,
Yes.
because one of the things that we tend to see too is they cut labor.
Yes.
And we can't have less nurses working. We can't have less, cleaning aides. We need all of this various different resources. I don't see how people don't understand that this is detrimental to our healthcare system and detrimental to, that'll affect not just you and me, but it'll affect them. So what would you say to, our patients and other families that are listening that are kind of still trying to understand what's happening? Like, what would you say how they can get involved?
Well, again, I mean, what's needed here is pressure on the provincial government to honor its commitment to clear away the backlogs of surgeries, to get the people off the stretchers in hallways, and to meet the needs of an aging and growing population, which they've been, very reluctant to do. So their voices, there will be, protests coming to the communities as all of us fight these cuts. Like North Bay is an example. They just announced 40 staff cuts, including nurses in the ER, where there's already they can't meet the provincial wait times for the ER, and the CEO pretends that it's no biggie, everything will be fine. Well, it won't be fine. The wait times are going to be longer. That's the reality, and we don't want that. We want people to be seen promptly. We don't want people dying because they didn't get seen on time, or they were sent home because they got exhausted waiting. But we all have a responsibility to step up and apply pressure. Unfortunately, we deal with the healthcare system as individuals often, right? As
Yeah.
people who require a test or a surgery or a treatment. And but we have systemic problems which are impacting individual care, and the only solution is collective action.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think this is where, again, we have to find a way, because policing does it, firefighters do it,
Yes.
to really build community And I think that's going to be the biggest part, because if we can all step in the same direction, the power that we would have would be insurmountable to making change and to keep patients and families safe. Like that is the end goal. Like the end goal is always to be like, well, yes, we want to have safe care, but if we're safe, then we can make you safe. And I think people still see that disconnect. And again, it's really letting people know that this is your care. It's not just us. We're just not out here complaining. We're trying to explain how this is going to affect. There was a recent report, I think it was an MEI report that came out about nursing workforce. We see that moral injury and that moral distress, knowing that these things continue to happen. Nurses are still leaving. There are many nurses that I speak to that are like, we will not re-enter until there'll be some drastic changes. We talked about the staffing ratios that will help make change. We talked about, providing safer workplaces and mobilizing better supports around mental health. I would say these are kind of easy wins. If you do your pick chart, I can't do this, kill that, do this. These are easy wins. So I think you're right. Collective action is going to be it. And I'm standing behind you 100%. And whatever I can do to continue to mobilize conversations, to show up, I will be doing that too. And
we'll
asking other people to do it, because we have to do this. Like this is I have 4 kids. This is their future too, right? At the end of the day, yes, I'm going to be affected by it, but they're going to be really affected by it. So there's a lot of work that we need to do, and I'm willing to pull up my sleeves, and I think many other people are too. So let us know what we can do. And we'll be out there fighting for change.
We'll fight together. We'll fight side by side.
Yeah. So thank you so much for coming on the Gritty Nurse podcast, Michael. The work that you're doing is instrumental. I've been watching you and following you, and I'm just like, yes, one of these days I'm going to be him. Maybe I'll be a union leader.
Yeah, you should be a union leader. It'd be
but
great.
Honestly, the work that you're doing is amazing. And I'm so proud that we have people like you that have dedicated their life to seeing change through and using your voice and power for agency. So thank you so much, Michael, for coming.
For sure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Looking for a great gift for a nurse or someone who needs to learn about nursing? Check out my national best-selling book, The Wisdom of Nurses, Stories of Grit from the Bedside. Thank you so much for listening to The Gritty Nurse with Amie Archibald-Varley. If you're watching on YouTube or listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or any other podcast platform, please hit the subscribe button so you'll never miss out on any awesome episodes from The Gritty Nurse. Thank you so much, and stay tuned until next time. Stay gritty.